All right, taking you out to the West Coast, we are chatting with Philippa Gamse. She's the president of Websites That Win International. She's 25 years in digital marketing strategy and analytics. Philippa, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Yeah, good morning, Matthew. Great to see you.
So I'm curious, how did you, having done marketing and digital marketing for over 25 years, right? You've been at this well before podcasting was a thing. So how'd you kind of find your way into, helping and guiding podcasters when it comes to strategizing and understanding whether or not their content is successful?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I guess, because a podcast is a strategy in some ways, um, because a lot of people are doing podcasting in order to obviously get more visibility, to sell, their services, their expertise, their products, etc., right? So podcasting is actually essentially a marketing strategy as well for many people. And therefore, part of my brief is also to help those people make that work better for them.
So what are some of the what are some of the things that when new clients come in, especially podcast clients come in, like what are some of the big mistakes, the big red flags, like the lost opportunities that you are seeing from them off the bat?
Yeah. So for podcasts specifically, I think there's a couple of things. One that I see a lot is if you think about the typical website where people say, here are my recent podcasts, right? It's a long list. And as you create a new podcast, the newest one goes to the top of the page, right? And everything else moves down. And as everything else moves down, that means that the chances of those lower podcasts being seen by a visitor get less and less because people don't typically scroll. So what you can see, because you can see how many people view each episode, is that those visitor numbers or those viewer numbers just completely drop off after the first, say, top three. And I mean, in many ways, that's a real shame, right? Because there's probably really great content in those episodes that both the person who was the guest and also the podcast host can benefit from having that visibility continue. And so one of the things that we can do, or that I've done with some of my clients, is to make suggestions like, hey, let's think about how to use this content again and again. Like, can we, I know some hosts re-promote it, which is helpful. They'll go back and they'll do things like over the new year that we've just had, I saw a whole load of best podcast of 2024 lists, right? So you get another chance to cycle it round. But for example, creating category pages on the website. So maybe you can categorize the content of the podcast with different ways, different hashtags, different keywords, whatever. So you split them up in some ways. So you haven't just got one long laundry list. You've got maybe almost like a presentation list and then detail pages and so almost like an e-commerce site, right? But for podcasts.
I'm curious, these days, I feel like we rarely travel to websites to scroll to find information. I feel like information is pushed at us from all angles, from email, from ads, from social, from videos, from friends, right? Like, how often do people really get pushed a podcast episode, even a blog post article, read it, then go back to that main list and start looking through other ones?
Well, I think that depends on each individual, and obviously using the analytics, you can tell that. But I'm also thinking about the fact that people are looking in search engines for content, and sometimes they will look like if you have a search engine on your own site, which is actually a great idea because it's great market research, they will look in that search engine, right? So if you have a really well-known podcast on, I don't know, leadership, for example, they might look for aspects of leadership, team building, or in your search engine to see what else you've got, and that can happen. Plus, people are doing keyword searches, and don't forget, YouTube is also a big search engine. It's the second most used search engine after Google, and of course, it's actually owned by Google anyway, right? And so, if you have good keywords on your podcasts, those people will look for those and those podcasts will appear in YouTube results as well. So that's why I'm saying that just making some text around your podcast so that the search engines can find out or can index it is also really beneficial in promoting your content.
Yeah, it's funny. I always told people, I used to work a long time ago. I worked for the Wall Street Journal. And one of the things that helped us with our podcasts were once we started to embed audio players into other articles or, into like a related article. It's like, oh, you're reading about this story. By the way, check out this episode from 3 months ago that, is kind of similar. Is that something that you see being beneficial and working? And, I know podcasters have like 100 or, 150 episodes and 200 blog posts. It's a lot of work to kind of do that, but is it worth that investment of time and effort?
Absolutely. And again, if you're somebody who's selling services and you're podcasting because you're building your expertise, your authority, and your credibility, then of course on your website, along with the podcast episodes on that page, you can also have a sidebar, for example, with calls to action that highlight maybe your book or your services, your free consulting call, whatever it is, right? So on that page, you're not just promoting your podcast, but you're promoting what other aspects of what you do you want people to see. And obviously, the more you draw people to your pages, the more they're going to see those other calls to action, which is actually how you generate the revenue, right?
So let's get back to the crux of what you do, which is really look at our analytics. What do podcasters do wrong when it comes to reviewing their analytics, analyzing their analytics, and using that to form a strategy?
Yeah, so the other thing I actually wanted to say about podcast analytics and specifically, I mean, this also applies to videos, is that one of the other things that you can tell is how much of the podcast people actually listen to or how much of the video people actually watched. And I see a huge amount of drop off because I tell this story. I had a client who absolutely prolific video maker, and he did a lot of interviews, which, podcast interview, whatever, right? And he was horrified to hear when he had no idea. When we looked at his analytics, he would start off this whole thing with a good morning, my name is blah, 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 and I've been doing this for 100 years. And, and it was boring. I mean, he did it every time. And people just dropped off by 30 seconds, 50% of his audience for the video or the podcast or whatever had gone. That's crazy, right? And by a minute, 90% of them had gone. And he had no idea. And I said to him, you've got to start the thing by saying, good morning, today we're going to talk about this, and it's going to be really exciting, and you're going to learn this, and you need to listen to the end, because at the end we're going to, and it sounds cheesy, but it helps and it works, right? You need to hook people and get interesting pretty quickly. And I see this a lot, that people do drop off. I mean, people's attention span, as we all know now, is really, really short, right?
I couldn't agree with you more. It's something that whenever I was consulting clients, I always talked about no cat talk, right? When we were starting out, Mark Maron, WTF podcast was the biggest thing. And he would go on and on for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes about his personal life before we bring on the interview. And so we would work with these business clients who are like, well, I want to talk about myself too. It's like, yeah, but you sold to your audience that this podcast is about X. Nobody cares about your cat. So stop wasting everybody's time and let's get right to it. And yeah, it's, if you're a comedian, if you're doing something that is more relationship building, more community building, more, about you, personality based, fine. Show us your personality. Tell us about what's going on. Talk about your cat, your dog, whatever. But right, if you're doing an investment podcast about what's going on in the markets, I don't care. Tell me what's going on with the markets, right? Let's get to it. And to your point, if you're hearing this, because I to this day, there's still people who don't realize that they can find that kind of information. If you are not yet connected to your show through Apple's Podcast Connect, do so right away. Claim your show, get your show, do that. That will give you some of the best analytics to do exactly what Philippa was talking about, which is tell you like, great, here's your audience, here's where they're dropping off, here's how long they listen for, here's the percentage of completion, here's how many people listen who are actually followers of your show, or how many people came along just because you had a great guest on it. So, to do what you were talking about, definitely make sure you're on Apple Podcast Connect, and we'll be sure to put a link in the show notes so you can find that. So let's go back. So what other analytics are podcasters either missing or not using correctly to analyze their show and understand how well they're really doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the big ones. And as I said, the focus of my consulting is to help people with their business strategy overall, right? And therefore, most of the time, if I'm working with somebody who has a podcast, it's because they're using that podcast to grow their business. So that's what I'm looking for, is the relationship between the podcast and their overall business outcomes. And part of that is how successful the individual episodes are, which we've just talked about. And then part of it is what do people do as a result of listening to the podcast? And are there things that you want them to do? Are you making those clear? Are you driving people to those outcomes?
So not only is it, are you driving them to those outcomes, but are you tracking that, right? Like a lot of podcasts, we're obsessed with downloads, right? If the point of this is to sell services, right, you can get 10 sales off 100 downloads or 10 sales off 1,000,000 downloads. The first one is more successful. So how do you make sure that you are, like, what are some of the tools? What are some of the tips? What are some of the things that you tell your clients to do to make sure that people who are checking out your content are then doing the things that you want them to do?
So, I mean, obviously, I'm a marketer. Calls to action are really important. Honestly, in my experience, if you literally don't tell people what to do next, there's a very high chance that they won't, because you can't leave people to figure it out. You've got to be in their face and say that, hey, by the way, I do this. Is this interesting to you? So there's the very specific. If you like this, if you'd like more, if you'd like to talk to me, here's what you do next, right? And there's also less specific and less quantifiable things like what we call brand awareness. So if you see searches for your name, for example, the numbers of people searching for your name, they've heard the show, and then later they look for your website, but they know your name because they've heard the show, or they look for the show. So looking at whether the number of people proactively looking for you is increasing, and can also, and again, on social media, we haven't mentioned social media yet, but again, this all extends into your social media presence as well, so that you can see whether just the number of people who have heard of you goes up. And there's that thing about PR and people hearing about you, that something like people need to hear your name or your like 9 times or something before they remember
like
it.
7 or 9 or 11 before they'll do anything.
Right. So all of that benefit is something that you can also measure.
Do you encourage clients to use like specific tracking codes in all their links? So like not just, here's our newsletter link, UTM code podcast, but do you also say like, no, make sure you say which podcast episode you're doing, which which category it's in, so that what kind of content is performing better than others?
Yeah, great question. It's really helpful if you're doing an email newsletter, for example, where you're promoting your podcast, or even if it's a link off of a social media posting. You can add, a little bit techie here, but you can add what we call UTM parameters, and you can look up what that is in Google. It's not hard to do, and you can get tools that will build them for you if you say what you want them to say, right? But then it will specifically say this link was to this podcast episode. It was this specific ad campaign, this specific email newsletter, whatever. And then you can start seeing which type of content, which type of messaging, which types of calls to action, which social media platforms, are the most effective for you. And again, that can really help inform what you do in the future.
So let's go back and let's talk about social media. What are podcasters doing wrong when it comes to promoting their content on social media? More importantly, measuring how successful they are doing on social media.
So again, I'm not a social media strategist. I'm a web strategist. But again, if you're using social media to drive people to your website where you have your podcast and also the other things that you offer, you want to make sure that you're getting quality visits. So you want to make sure that the people who come in from social media are engaged in what you're doing. I.e., they listen to the podcast, maybe they go to other pages, right? They don't just take one look and walk away. And that's why we want to make sure that we're tagging things so that we know exactly which posting each visitor came from. Because what we're looking for, as I said, is which are the quality visitors. Because I think you said this earlier, you can have 1 million visitors, and if none of them buy anything or do any of the stuff you want them to do, sign up for your newsletter, subscribe to your channel, whatever it is, then who cares if you had 1 million visitors, right? To some extent. So really understanding where your quality traffic comes from is really important, and which therefore, do you do better when you promote on Instagram than when you promote on LinkedIn? It will be different for every business, and I think that's a really important thing to say. Like, don't believe stuff that says everybody should be doing TikTok or Facebook, or while we still can, I don't know. It's really important to figure out what works for your business.
That is also something I've always said to folks is, what's the best network for my podcast? I don't know what your podcast about, right? If you're doing a craft podcast, well, you should be on Etsy and Instagram. And if you're doing a business podcast, well, you should be on LinkedIn, right? So it's not about which platform is best for podcasts, which best your podcast. I just want to go back. You were talking earlier about that call to action. And yeah, I've always had the sense that I don't say this to be cruel, but as a podcaster, you have to assume your audience is dumb and lazy. So if you don't tell them what to do and you don't make it as easy as possible for them to do it, they are not going to, and you're going to be very frustrated with the results. Are there particular ways to frame your call to actions or, talk about them that tend to, generate more success than others? Or are there common ones out there that you're like, God, I wish people would stop using this as a call to action. It never works.
Well, and this is a huge thing that I see a lot, is make sure that people can see them. I know this sounds really stupid, but a lot of times you see the call to action is way at the bottom of the page, or it's at the top of the page and it disappears. But there's nothing wrong with having more than multiple calls to action, if you like. But a lot of the time, one of the big problems that I see is that the call to action just isn't even obvious to people. Which, I mean, a lot of this is, I find with analytics, it's kind of you're kind of hitting your forehead stuff. But that's, I don't blame site owners for that, because one of the things that I think happens is that we're all so close to our own stuff that it doesn't occur to us that people can't see it, or it doesn't stand out to somebody who's never seen this stuff before, because we know it's there and we're so used to it. And I've had this a lot, site owners will say, but it's right there. And you say, yeah, you can see it. Or it's in the menu bar. Yeah, right. But if I don't look at the menu bar, then I'm not going to see it, right? So number one, definitely make sure that you typically have more than one in a page and people can see it. And the other thing is make it action oriented to whatever it is that you're looking for them to do. And so maybe sign up for our newsletter, but if your newsletter has something that's a really valuable offering with it, get X, whatever X is now, or something like that actually builds the benefit into the call to action. And the thing about analytics is it's quite easy these days to test. The point of analytics, right, is not just to see the numbers, but to say, what am I going to do about this? And we can make our best guess about what it is that might be going wrong or might improve the results, but you actually need to test. So it's quite easy to get tools that help you do that by sort of changing the wording on the call to action, serving up different variants at different times so you can see the results, right? So you can do all this. You have to think about it a bit, but it can really pay off.
What would you say to the idea of white noise? So, there are some podcasters, and this is true, not just podcasts, this happens all over the place, but, you say the same thing every single episode, right? Your intro is exactly the same. Your outro is exactly the same. Use the exact same language to the point where now your regular listeners are kind of tuning it out. Do you think that's a problem? Do you think you should be rotating call to actions or, rephrasing them every time just so that they don't get stale and lost in the noise?
I think I think that's a consultant's favorite "it depends" answer. Um,
I gave a lot of those back in the day. I know what you're talking about.
well, if it's short, I mean, we've already talked about not having massively long intros in any way because it's just, you know, and there's always going to be a proportion of people who've never heard it before. If you know it works and it's short and catchy, I mean, look at all the comedians that have catchphrases that we all know and love, and we just expect them to say them, right? Um, and if they don't say them, I mean, I'm from the UK, as you can hopefully hear.
I had a
Um,
suspicion.
and there was, when I was a kid, there was a comedy duo that had this song they would sing at the end of every it was a TV show, right? And I mean, you were waiting for them to sing it because it's a great song. And if they didn't sing it, it was something was wrong. So sometimes those standard endings and things can be helpful anyway in that relationship building that you talked about. Um, so I mean, again, you can look at your results and you can see when you start that standard beginning or standard ending, do a lot of people tune out? If they do, then maybe that's a clue that it's time to change it up. I mean, the good news about analytics now is that we have all sorts of data that we didn't used to have that we can harness to say, how do I make this better?
Makes a lot of sense. We have been chatting with Philippa Gamse. She is the president of Websites That Win International. You can learn more at websitesthatwin.com. Philippa, before we let you go, we have a couple of questions we'd like to ask everybody who comes on the show. First thing is, I know you're not, technically a podcast expert, but, I know you've been doing a lot of podcast guesting and you work with clients with their podcasting. Is there something about the podcasting space, whether it's from the listening side, production side, data side, whatever, that you would like to see improved in the near future?
Sometimes I like sites that give you a transcript as well. I know that's more difficult, but I guess with AI, it's easier now. And I'm talking about as a consumer, because sometimes I know that the guest is talking about something that I really want to hear. I don't have a lot of time. I'd love to be able to just get what they said in an easy, quick, like without having to listen to the whole thing. Or maybe it will tell, the ones that have summaries that say, at 5 minutes we start talking a bit about this, and at 8 minutes we're talking about this, so you can sort of jump in. Just when you're short of time, but you really want the information.
Do you think it's okay to use AI transcripts that have not been cleaned up? Like, AI is good, not great, but real transcripts with the full fix are, like you said, they're not cheap.
I know, and I agree, and I think that is an issue, and maybe that will get better. And I don't. Obviously, it's not helpful to read a transcript because we don't talk in structured sentences when we're talking. I just changed my direction in mid-sentence, right? And that's hard to read if you're trying to read it. So yes, it would be nice. And I get that that's expensive. You asked me, blue sky question, what would I like to see? And so that was my answer.
Oh, no. I agree I agree with your answer. I was just curious, as again, with the website analytics and whatnot, if there's if there's a big downside to them being AI generated and not human curated. So appreciate that. Is there any tech on your wish list that you're looking to get for podcasting? Mic, camera, software, platform, like something that again would just be great for the world of podcasting?
Probably something that I don't know. I am pretty happy with my setup, but I mean, there's something that doesn't exist that might, make me look better in on camera or something with my camera and my zoom and my, lighting and stuff that I don't have to mess with,
Just
that
set it up and go.
that it knows what to do and I don't have to think about it. That would be lovely.
All right. Well, fortunately, we are working on a solution for just that. So I'll be back in touch with you about that one.
Excellent.
And
Right.
lastly, are there podcasts that you listen to that are your absolute favorites that whenever they have a new episode, you are going to listen to them, or you'll never miss one of their episodes?
I'm afraid it's a UK based podcast. Is
That's
that
okay.
right?
Which one? Well, let's give them love anyway.
I am a politics and news junkie. And there's a couple of podcasts that I get out of the UK that the rest is politics. And then I'm actually just going into my favorite podcast directory here to. There's one called the rest is politics, and there's one called the news agents. The rest, and there's a Rest is Politics US version of the Rest is Politics, but they're really good discussions of what's going on with really experienced broadcasters and journalists, and there's the one called the news agents as well is I love. And then there's actually one called The Rest is History, which is amazing stories from history that they really dive in depth into things that we didn't know about, or that we could know more, and they make it really interesting and human. And yeah,
Love it. I'm a fan of good political and/or history podcasts, so I will give that one a spin. Once again, it's Philippa Gamse, president of Websites That Win International. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.